Good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever you're joining us today. We're going to give a couple more seconds for everyone to join us here on the webinar. But allow me to already kick off by welcome everyone to the... Good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever you're joining us. I've got a recall. So welcome to the European Centre for International Political Economy and our third event as part of the EU-Mercosur series. My name is Emily Rees, and it's a great pleasure to be with you today to tackle an incredibly timely subject, and that is the role of trade policy in enforcing the Paris Climate Accord. In 10 days, delegations from around the world, as you know, will be in Glasgow for the UN Climate Change Conference, the COP26. And for nearly 3 decades now, the UN has been bringing countries together to tackle this impending climate crisis. And 30 days in, here we are. I mean, we're rapidly crawling towards a critical point of non-return. We all know that we must keep the 1.5 degrees within reach and use every instrument available to get there. So essentially, trade and climate no longer live in separate silos, and that's what we're going to be discussing today. We know that the composition of trade flows affects the climate, and domestic climate policies impact trade flows. And so essentially, well, we can see how these extreme climatic events can affect trade and how trade policy should be leveraged to fight climate change. Figuring out how trade policy should be leveraged to enforce the Paris Climate Accord is far less evident. And so today, our speakers will be considering this question from 3 main angles. And that is, firstly, from a multilateral angle, in assessing what trade policies can come out of COP and what climate policies can come out of the WTO. We'll then look at the bilateral element in analysing the effectiveness of climate provisions in trade deals. We can look at the EU-Mercosur trade deal as an example of that. And then finally, we're going to look at unilateral measures, and particularly carbon border adjustment mechanisms. We have an EU proposal now. Other countries are considering these measures. All of that is going to be, I would say, the wider context of how trade and climate are going to join together in the years to come. And for this discussion, I'm absolutely honoured to introduce you to a lineup of exceptional experts, 2 from Europe and 2 from Mercosur, to debate this issue. First, I'd like to give a big welcome to Eleonora Catella. She's Deputy Director for International Relations at Business Europe. She's joining us here from Brussels. Eleonora is responsible for transatlantic trade policy, but also relations with Mercosur. And she's played a substantial role in defining businesses' input into not only the EU open strategic autonomy, but also the integration of sustainable development in European free trade agreements. Welcome, Eleonora. Rodrigo Lima, you are the Director General of Agroeconi, a São Paulo research agency focused on climate change, trade, and environmental protection. Since gaining your PhD in international economic law, you've been focusing much on the nitty-gritty, if you'll allow me, of multilateral environmental agreements and trade policy. Rodrigo is a specialist of climate negotiations well before the Paris Climate Accord, but also of the Cartagena Biosecurity Protocol, the Convention on Biological Diversity, amongst others. And he is the author of a book on the defense of legitimate non-trade objectives. We've heard a lot about those in recent days in the WTO. Welcome. Stéphanie Noël, turning to you. Stéphanie is well-known as being one of the trailblazers for trade and environment in Geneva. You're an international trade lawyer registered with the Paris and Geneva bars and a member of the editorial board of the Global Trade and Customs Journal. You've published some detailed analysis of fighting climate change through the review of process and production methods within the WTO rulebook. So we really look forward to your perspective on this. Stéphanie is also the co-founder of the Trade Policy Exchange, which is a platform to promote debates on trade policy within international institutions, government, civil societies, and business. Finally, a big welcome to Constanza Negri Piasuti, who is an experienced economic diplomacy professional. Constanza is originally from Argentina. She worked as Deputy Director for International Affairs at Eurochambre, the European Chambers of Commerce here in Brussels, before moving to Brasilia, where she is Economic Diplomacy and Competitiveness Manager at the Brazilian Confederation of Industry. Constanza is a very active member of Women Inside Trade, a network of female trade professionals. And it is in, I would say, with the independence of that viewpoint that she's going to be intervening today. So welcome to you all. I'd like to remind everyone that's joining us online that we will give more ample time for questions and answers. So if you have questions, please pop them in as early as possible into the chat function, and we'll get to as many questions as possible. So let's kick off first with trade in the COP and climate in the WTO. And I'd like to turn first to Rodrigo. Rodrigo, can you provide us with an overview of what was signed in Paris? I mean, what are nationally determined contributions, and how do the enforcement of nationally determined contributions affect trade? And finally, if you can go there in a little time, what should we be expecting from COP26 in Glasgow?
Thanks, Emily. Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a very tough question because trade and environment are expected to be mutually supportive, but how to make this happen is not a very easy question. And to address that, I think it is very important to think that the Paris Agreement was built using what the different countries, the parties, brought to the table during the negotiations in terms of what they need, what are the realities, what they are expecting to do in terms of mitigation and adaptation and technology and capacity building and so on. So when parties during the negotiation process decided to consult internally and bring their proposals to build an agreement, this was actually the deal breaker for the Paris Agreement, because at the Kyoto Protocol, we had the negotiations trying to agree on a target that would be then divided by the different parties. At the Paris Agreement, with this INDC process, there was the intended nationally determined contributions that parties was supposed to implement, then became the nationally determined contributions, the NDCs. It's not intended anymore, it's an obligation right now. So this process allowed all of the countries to bring their what they want and what they need to do to manage sustainable development on a climate change scenario. So this rationale, it's extremely important because parties brought what they want. There's the common but differentiated responsibilities guiding principle from the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement that basically captured the historic responsibility of developed countries to climate change, and tries to balance what different countries will do in terms of mitigation, adaptation, finance, for instance, that is basically from developed countries, and using the NDCs that should be improved over time and prepared every 5 years, presented new and improved NDCs every 5 years. The Paris Agreement expects to move on, and the enforcement, the implementation of the agreement will allow parties to move on and get to the target of limiting temperature increase on a maximum of 1.5 degrees. So without this rationale from building the agreement from bottom up, looking to what every country needs to do to tackle the problem, we will probably not have the Paris Agreement. It was a deal breaker in terms of allowing to achieve a multilateral agreement on climate change. If we look to this rationale of the NDCs, and that parties should implement their NDCs according to their needs, according to climate findings, according to several different aspects, we need to implement this from now on. From 2021, some countries consider 2020 as the starting date and so on. But if we look from an implementation perspective, and that parties brought what they need to do, we will need to understand and to monitor, and there's the enhanced transparency framework of the Paris Agreement, the global stocktake. There are processes by which countries will be analyzed, scrutinized, monitored in terms of what they are delivering, right? So it's a very peculiar process that allows to manage the agenda forward. We know that if we look to the 155 NDCs presented by 191 parties, we are far away from getting to what the IPCC tells us that we need to get to the 1.5 degree. So we need to have more ambition, more ambition, more ambition. And then we are getting to COP26 with the whole debate of climate neutrality targets by countries and by companies and by different stakeholders adopting climate neutrality targets, because what we have, it's not enough. It's not sufficient to get there, right? And we are thinking globally. That's the agreement itself, not country by country, getting to trade and saying, Constanza, you need to produce using, following some requirements, because otherwise I'm not following my targets. And then we need to understand that countries define how they will implement their targets, and if they will require mandatory obligations for some sectors to reduce emissions. This is basically natural for the big emitters, that they will need to implement mandatory mitigation actions. And then you will move energy, you will move different actions that will try to reduce emissions, including the use of carbon markets and so on. So this is basically the rationale of the Paris Agreement trying to be implemented over time to get there. I know that we are far away from the targets, which brings the idea of the relation with trade on a very for countries that really are adopting measures and policies as a possible manner to reduce emissions and to avoid huge problems with some specific sectors. As the case of Brazil, I would say deforestation. How I can import something that is not connected to a huge amount of emissions. This is how you do life cycle analysis and how you do calculations and so on. So this is a very not an easy task as we are about to discuss. Just to sum up what we can expect from COP26, the most challenging issue on the table at the negotiation side, and I follow the negotiations. So for me, the most challenging issue on the table is to finalize the rules book of the carbon markets, Article 6, because we need to, carbon markets, it's a way of allowing parties and the private sector to reduce emissions, so part of their emissions. So we need to have the carbon markets starting to work, because otherwise we will continue lagging behind, and this is not good. So this is the hard issue on the table. And I don't expect that every detail of the carbon markets, Article 6.2, 6.4, will be agreed in Glasgow. the structure must be agreed, but the details we will need to manage these in the following years. And then climate finance, for sure, as well, because we need to be able to have the $100 billion per year that we agreed in Copenhagen in 2009, and now we are in 2021, and we don't have yet the total amount, at least 100 billion. And then there's other topics as well, but those climate finance and carbon markets, and of course the publication of climate neutrality targets, as the case of Brazil, for example. Brazil is expected to present something about this, and we are very anxious about what Brazil will bring to the table. Thank you.
I mean, carbon markets, the finance element, they're being incredibly important as we move into COP, and this allows me to segue quite nicely. We read a recent article that was penned by the Director General of the World Trade Organization, Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala. And so this opinion in the Financial Times, she called on world leaders to adopt the global carbon pricing at COP26. As you mentioned, that's probably quite an ambitious goal for this next COP. But I don't know about you, but I could feel her sense of concern also about the divergence. As you were saying, you know, these NDCs were based on differentiated national realities, differentiated responsibilities. And I get the feeling that she's also concerned about the certain divergence in responsibilities coming from international institutions, and not least the link between UN agencies and the World Trade Organization. She mentioned in that article that World Trade Organization members had notified over 4,500 climate-related measures to the WTO, and that goes from, you know, direct taxes and regulation since 2009, which would be expected, as you mentioned, as a result of Copenhagen. But the concern here is an atomization of these initiatives, and the fact that we already have around 60 carbon pricing schemes around the world, that this fragmentation seems to be on the up. And it's going to create large trade frictions if a solution can't be found to better consolidate the trade elements with the climate policy. So turning to you, Stéphanie, is Dr. Ngozi correct in warning about this fragmentation? And do you see a role for the WTO in this? I mean, is it feasible really to bring climate change within the current climate that we have in Geneva, which is one of an institution in need of reform?
Yes. Well, first, I would like to pick up on what Rodrigo said, because he reminded the context of the Paris Agreement. So first, I would like to specify that actually the Paris Agreement doesn't say anything on how you can achieve your targets, right? So it's a bit touchy to talk about trade policy as an enforcement tool, because you can choose the way you're going to meet your target, right? So, and you must take into account, of course, the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. So, of course, keeping that in mind, you can see a lot of different unilateral measures. Ranging from a regulatory measure to cap and trade systems or taxation, and most of them are accompanied with border adjustment. So, of course, this poses a very big risk, not only for trade frictions, but also that's a problem for the effectiveness of this climate policy, because it also impair investment. It increase compliance costs for businesses. So of course that's a serious problem. And so you're asking me if I actually see a role for the WTO. Actually, that's the role of the WTO to support sustainable trade to support this, because I need to remind you that it's really, it expressly mentioned in the preamble of the WTO agreement, right? So the role of the WTO is to promote sustainable development. And it has been recalled last week, I think it was last week, by Catherine Tai. She was in Geneva, and she reminded that we must go back to the roots of the institution of the multilateral trading system. Actually, trade is not an end in itself, and one of the objectives is sustainable development. So it is the role of the WTO. I don't see a role for the WTO. That's its role. That's the perfect forum to discuss measure. The problem is that it has not translated into concrete action, if I may say. So even though the topic is discussed widely in Geneva, but so far you don't have any legal framework or any guidelines on climate mitigation measures that affect trade. And this is a big concern. And so we can hear very often that countries can take measures for environmental purposes as long as they are not discriminatory or disguised restriction on international trade. But it's not as simple as that. So I won't go into the details, of course, unless you ask me, but that's very controversial, especially when it comes to border adjustment measures. It's not that self-evident whether or not a measure, even though it's not discriminatory, even if it's origin neutral and it's not supposed to be discriminatory, it's not self-evident whether it complies with WTO. And I think it's really important to stress that you cannot rely too much on an exception. So I refer, of course, to that of Article 20. So I do not want to really focus too much on that, but just to pass through a message today, which is the WTO must really act upon that and try to fix the shortcomings of the legal framework, because you were referring to Dr. Ngosi's proposal to set a global carbon pricing, but I think it's in the short run or in the medium term, it might not be really feasible. It can be a long-term objective, of course, but I think to be pragmatic, today we should focus maybe on how to, on cooperation between countries and find common agreement and consensus on unilateral measures. Because otherwise it's going to be really difficult.
So we'll get to the CBAM in a moment, but I mean, what I'm hearing from you, yes, this is central to what the WTO was set up to do, and yet it's there to put into place policies that should help fight the climate crisis. However, it shouldn't be there to enforce the Paris Agreement. If that's what I'm getting from both of you, is that a correct reading?
Yeah, I mean, what I'm trying to say is actually the WTO is the correct forum to talk about that. But I think we have moved away from the objective of the WTO, of the original objective, which and sustainable development was an objective. And what we have witnessed is an incapacity of the WTO to really take action to make it a reality. And so it's only through an exception that the WTO plays a role. And it's not even sure, so I can go back to that Article 20, but I won't do a legal analysis, but I would say there's too much uncertainty around it. And I would like to remember that one of the purposes of the agreement is to avoid protectionism. And, I think that originally members should have been able to take a measure, even discriminatory. So, I mean, that could discriminate between products based on their carbon footprint, for example. I think this should have been possible unless it was protectionist. But we have moved away from this objective to the appellate body did this because it's in a very legalistic decision decided that you cannot discriminate between products, even though they are origin neutral. You cannot discriminate them based on the production process, right?
So this is, I mean, part of the process and production methods.
Yes.
I think that Rodrigo also mentioned when we were talking about the part of embedded deforestation.
Yes, exactly. Also, greenhouse gas emission released by change in land use, this kind of thing, and we cannot really measure those things. So it's difficult to, in a way, I think that it should have been originally.
I can see Rodrigo here. Rodrigo, can we measure those things?
Yeah, I agree that some, if we use life cycle analysis methodologies, we can measure carbon footprints. Basically, not for everything that we want to produce, but for a lot of things we can. But the tough issue is every one of us here can have our own methodologies. Who is the best? Emily, Stephanie, Eleonora has the best methodology. So we will fight for the methodology to do the best calculations. And we will have different results. And we will adopt measures or not adopt measures based on the results. So this is the tough question. The WTO, as Stephanie mentioned, I think lost their time on trying to address those issues on a minimum ground for all its members, because now we are seeing what's happening. And ultimately, we will have a TBT panel, and we will create a panel of experts trying to do carbon footprints calculations to agree if this is reasonable, discriminatory or not.
So the trade tensions are going to come in through a sort of a turf war over life cycle analysis methodologies, essentially. Thank you so much for bringing in that multilateral perspective. If you'll allow me, I'd like to turn really quickly now to the question of free trade agreements, particularly the trade and sustainable development provisions linked to fighting climate change. Today here in Europe, the inclusion of climate provisions is now practically mandatory, as the Parliament will not agree to ratify a trade or investment agreement without it. In the EU-Mercosur deal, we also saw the introduction of a specific article that was dedicated to trade and climate change, in addition to the usual provisions that we would find relating to the enforcement of multilateral environmental agreements. It was interesting, though, that it did constitute sort of its own sort of paragraph, article in that agreement. Now, I'd like to turn here to the women with the most experience in dealing with climate policy from a business perspective, and that's Constanza and Eleonora. Constanza, if I can turn to you first. If countries have already committed to endorsing their NDCs, which we've just heard from Rodrigo, what is the point of putting these climate provisions with the question of enforceability in a trade deal? Can trade deals make a difference?
Thank you, Emily. Good morning. A pleasure to be here sharing with you on this such an important topic. Plenty of open questions, few solutions, but it's extremely needed and timely to discuss about those at different levels. So when we look into the bilateral dimension, before getting into a Paris Agreement commitment, I think we need to take into consideration a broader comments and aspects on including those type of provision. As you rightly mentioned, the EU is sort of the leader in this type of approach. So my first comment in general terms of that chapters would say that the first and main driver for implementing and really enforcing those compromises are at the national level, and that it's really dependent on a political will in different countries. So I would say that in general terms, FTAs, they can make some difference as far as we have some realistic expectations of what creating a difference means. So in most of the cases, the positive impacts that we could expect with those realistic expectations would be linked to leveraging or enhancing compromises that countries have already adopted or that they haven't adopted and they are willing to adopt. Ensuring consistency among international compromises in those two fields, reassuring that type of virtuous synergy among the two fields of trade and environment. And also, I would say, replying to government and civil society pressure and concerns that are raising at different stages and levels in countries. Of course, raising the profile of that agenda. And I think that this is a positive movement, and we need to recognize that. But because as you rightly mentioned, the pattern and the priorities of trade policy, they have been changing, the trade hands, and we cannot turn a deaf ear into that. But I would say that in this case, the devil is not exactly on the details, but on the right balance. What is the right balance between that environmental objectives that are pursued and the economic dimensions that FTAs need to pursue? So in my view, in general terms, those provisions, they fall short in terms of trying to sort out responses to global concerns. So if our expectations would be to go into the nitty-gritties of the house that Stephanie and Rodrigo were mentioning, or in trying to displace or switch negotiations forum, I don't see an added value on that happening very easily, especially if we look into the developing and developed countries strategies. So looking specifically into the specific of EU-Mercosur, I think it's a case in point in that type of provisions. The agreement has the most advanced rules on trade and sustainable development. It goes farther on its commitments that EU second generations FTAs. As rightly known, well known in Brazil, it covers a substantial set of principles and establishes a baseline for implementation, which is important. It goes even farther from principles because it tackles issues such as international agreements and the relations with those trade, climate change, biodiversity, and management of forests. So when and with the entering into force of the agreement, the EU-Mercosur could have and would be an opportunity to strengthen that current cooperation, to monitor the work in that area between the two countries. And this is also because the chapter has a subcommittee, so institutional setting that would allow for the structured dialogue. So I would say that in general terms, so Brazil has done it already, its NDCs, commitment, proposals, there's still, as Rodrigo mentioned, others to come. But the EU-Mercosur, it's a clear reference as a chapter that could contribute, provided that we have this realistic expectation of what we can be attained with this bilateral. It can really contribute and make a difference in terms of enhancing efforts and leverage to implement and monitor international compromises like the ones on NDCs, and even the other 7 instruments that are included and which Brazil already takes part. So I definitely think that the EU-Mercosur could make a difference, provided that we don't get into the nitty-gritty of the house, that this would be, in the case of the Paris Agreement, discussed and negotiated in another forum. That would be my quick sense on that.
I mean, that's a very clear overview. I mean, basically saying, okay, this is a very ambitious agreement in terms of the climate provision, but we need to be realistic about the hows. Leonora, I mean, you're in a situation here where sometimes in Brussels, some of the requests that are put on businesses or the Commission might not feel always very realistic, very ambitious, but in terms of their implementability, I would say. And I'd like really your view on this. I mean, you presented recently a position on the 15 action points for sustainable development, and obviously there was a big part of that which is now related to climate. But coming back to this question of enforceability, which tends to really focus the minds here in the European space, in the policy debate, are climate provisions in TSD chapters enforceable?
Thank you for the question. And the short answer to this is yes, they are enforceable. Now, I will go into the detail. So when actually we have not yet presented our reply in case anyone from DG Trade is listening and said, I didn't see anything from coming from Business Europe. We are still finalizing the contributions from our members, but we are of course going to do that in the next few days. Why do we, and we present our views also on enforcement. We present our views because there are specific questions on this. Is this current system enough, or there could be additional remedies for better enforcement? We think that there is a lot of merit in the current system, and we would like those benefits, those positive aspects, to be retained in the system. And these are really what makes me answer. Yes, climate provisions would be enforceable. For the moment, there is this is coming for the future agreements. For the moment, the Paris Agreement is inside the CETA through a recommendation of the first joint committee meeting of the EU and Canada that dates already back to 2018. They are enforceable because there is a system for dispute settlement, and we should not make the mistake of equalizing enforcement with sanctions. And if there are no sanctions in a mechanism, then you say, well, the system is not enforceable. We have a mechanism at the moment that involves not only the government-to-government side, which also Constanza mentioned, but also it involves civil society organizations. So, and that for us is a very key part, because you have a lot of civil society organizations that are on the ground and well positioned to monitor the implementation of trade and sustainable development chapters. So we have different steps of increasing public pressure on countries. So you have government-to-government consultations, you have the establishment of a panel of experts, you have the report of the panel of experts, and now we also have tested the system. We have seen not on environmental provisions or climate provisions yet, it was on labor with Korea, but we have seen that it has produced results. So there has been, at the end of the day, compliance with the report recommendations and the change in legislation, which would otherwise have not been possible. So of course you can always do more. Of course you can look at the glass and see if it is half empty or half full. There is always room for improvement, and we have pointed, for example, where there is room for improvement. We need to be more assertive. We have been shy so far in using the tools that we have. But definitely there is a mechanism at the moment, and thinking only of sanctions, so what I think brings in more questions than it answers at the moment, because you need to see how really they would apply in concrete terms. So with Mercosur, at the very least, even if we have the system that we know so far, we would have a mechanism that otherwise we wouldn't have. And that's the purpose of having climate provisions included in FTAs, because the Paris Agreement is not enforceable per se. If you link it in a bilateral free trade agreement, then you have tools at your disposal that you can use.
And that really brings a very solid point, Eleonora. So, I mean, essentially what you're saying is, thanks to the case that we've seen now with South Korea on labor, we can see that it is enforceable. So rather than, if I understand correctly, rather than placing in sanctions within the TSD chapter, we just need to have more people in the Chief Trade Enforcement Officer's unit at DG Trade. Is that how I should be reading it?
That would be one of the actions that we can take. Definitely, this was a very good improvement, a good additional tool that the Commission has come up with. They've put a lot of thinking into this, and I think it's a very good step. Of course, the problem with sanctions is that what we need here is, the final objective is to improve the situation on the ground. So how do you ensure that? How do you provide incentives for good behavior instead of just sanctioning misbehavior? That will not bring a change if it's, for example, due to lack of capacity, lack of capability, lack of, you have structural deficiencies. How then is that addressed? So focusing on the incentives is the positive element here.
And you give me a very good segue there about cooperation. And now I'd like to turn to perhaps a less a cooperative proposal and more of a unilateral one, which is that of the carbon border adjustment mechanism that the EU has been proposing. I mean, we've actually seen various countries now looking into different CBAMs as solutions, right, to fight climate change. And what we understand is it's really looking at a tool to fight the carbon leakage aspect and establish sort of a competitive level playing field, essentially, for businesses and industry. If I may go very quickly back to you, Eleonora, and I'm going to ask everyone to keep their responses very short on CBAM. I know it's a theme of great interest because we have some great questions coming in. I'd like to have the time to take those. So Eleonora, can you explain to us why is the EU seeking this CBAM, and what are the elements in the design of the measure that European businesses are most attentive to?
Okay, so the purpose of the CBAM is to level the playing field by equalizing the price of carbon and the price of CO2 emissions of domestic products and imported products in the EU. So this would also fight carbon leakage, which is basically by preventing that the production is shifted to places where there are weaker environmental policies. Because otherwise, all our climate ambition and the idea of being carbon neutral by 2030, for example, is completely nullified if you have carbon leakage. But ultimately, the goal of this legislative proposal is to encourage producers from third countries to do more and to be more emission efficient in the future in their production by using more emissions efficient technology. So this is the key.
If I may very quickly turn back to a Brazilian perspective, and I'm going to ask you both to give this sort of a quick fire. Rodrigo, Constanza, how is a country like Brazil looking at these CBAM proposals? Eleonora is saying that it's there to create a level playing field, but obviously this is something that I would imagine that people are very attentive to. Constanza first, and then we turn to Rodrigo. Quick fire, 1 minute.
Sure, such an enormous topic, but I think very quickly, I think Brazil is looking with a magnifying glass, I would say, to this topic. It's with, I would say, a mixed feelings of caution and concern, plenty of open questions. So I think that to sum up, I would say that it's too early a stage to many things still need to be defined. But in a certain way, the open questions Brazil is currently looking into is the right balance between traditional trade rules and environmental objectives, the balance between purely environmental measures on the one hand, measures that are aimed at addressing competitiveness issues, the consistency with multilateral rules, both at the WTO and Paris Agreement, and four, and not least, the impact on company adaptations. So I would say that in a way, in terms of their systemic dimension, that is a little bit concerning. While it is explained or presented as a pure environmental measure to comply with the WTO, its economic competitiveness objective is crystal clear. Well, even we listen to European private sector. So in a certain way, it's a global environmental problem that is being tackled with a unilateral economic measure with potential effects on trade. And I would say that is the main aspects and concern. Environmental point of view concerns, I would say the main is how are being taken into consideration the adoption of the public policy and commitments on the house that each country has their own rights to decide on the house, how are they being taken into consideration in the system that is extremely self-serving, looking into its own system, international in terms of discrimination, MFN, national treatment, different elements, legal elements that need to be deepened. And last but not least, in terms of the Brazilian perspective, I would like to raise this issue. In terms of coverage, it might look like Brazil is not among the first impact countries due to the exports, but there are two elements that we need to take in consideration. One, it's some of those sectors that are currently being covered or included in the proposal, they are under trade defense rules. So we are not looking into the optimal, let's say, trade flow of those sectors. Second, the coverage could be extended within the legislative process. So new sectors could come in. So I would say that and in terms of operational administrative burden that this can create to companies, this is another element that Brazil is looking. And if we multiply this to 4 type of schemes that could be created and even more by other countries, wouldn't be we ended up in a spaghetti CBAM well. So I will leave it here.
So we'll turn to Rodrigo on the spaghetti CBAM world. And then I really want to hear what Stephanie has to say on the competitiveness aspect, especially at a multilateral level.
Thanks so much, Emily and Constanza. I would use one expression that Eleonora mentioned, that trying to find a level playing field on all of this. And if we look to how countries build their NDCs and based on their needs, this is reality, right? Simply like that. And if we look at, is there a level playing field when we are looking to something like a spaghetti of CBAMs being implemented? If the NDCs are supposed to be implemented and monitored and enforced over time, and this is the basis of the Paris Agreement as a treaty, if several countries decide to adopt unilateral measures, we will be simply forgetting basically, you have to implement the NDCs. Each country will adopt its policies and so on, and they have obligation to bring this formally to the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement. But then you have the unilateral measures, and then if we are trying to find a level playing field, that is the traditional WTO language, that WTO actually was born because countries agreed a level playing field to be able to move on international trade common rules. How to find this level playing field, considering that most of the challenges attached to countries, specifically developing countries and least developed countries, relates to lack of access to energy, of access to credit, of access to subsidies to implement renewable energy, for instance. So is there a level playing field for everyone to play on this game? I don't see. And then you come up with several unilateral measures. You will make the game much more complicated.
And I think that's obviously one of the key points that's being brought up in Geneva, Stephanie, at the WTO. I mean, how is this proposal, the different CBAM proposals, sort of being scrutinized? I know there aren't specific, proposals in the table right now, but I mean, this fragmentation, the differentiated treatment issue, I think, how is that being perceived, Stephanie?
Well, as you know, it's very controversial, but so far it has not generated very, there's no fight over this. The problem is just being discussed in terms of WTO incompatibility. And the problem, my perception is that the discussion should go beyond this matter of consistency, because it's pointless. And as Rodrigo has said, and I must concur with him, this element of competitiveness, maybe would weaken claim that a measure could be justified under Article 20, because you have limited justification, and the competitiveness element is not part of that. Your measure must be purely, environmental, if I may say, just to simplify. So I think it's a big concern, but at the same time, I still do think that we should move on. And for the moment, I cannot foresee a global solution like a global price for carbon. So we should allow unilateral measures, but there should be a legal framework. And as I said before, just to make clear, you know what I think about it, we should allow countries to take measure and that which could be discriminatory based on the production process. This should be the case, but only if it's taken for a legitimate concern. That's really, and the issue there is we do not have any guidelines about that. So one part of the solution could be to discuss legal interpretation of the GATT. For example, that might be a solution, but it cannot be to allow this kind of discrimination, but it cannot go without an agreement which could take place within the framework of the UN on the measurement of greenhouse gas emission, for example, and also a discussion with developing countries, because as our panelists have said, it is an element that must be taken into account, because we're talking about differentiated responsibilities in terms of the burden that developing countries should bear, and financing is an investment opportunities, very big issue as well.
And if I may, I think there are a lot of questions that are coming in here from our audience, which are really addressing that point. There is a question about the differentiated obligations on developing countries. But what I'm hearing from you, Stéphanie, is essentially that these the legitimate non-trade objectives, if we can still call them that, need to be integrated into a PPM redesign. But I mean, that would obviously bring up a lot of questions, again, on this differentiation between developed and developing countries in a World Trade Organization. I can see Rodrigo there keen to step in, but I actually have a couple of questions here from the audience, which given the time, I'd like to address. And this one is for you, Rodrigo. There's been a lot of questions relating to the carbon footprint and the methodologies on the life cycle analysis, as we mentioned earlier. We have Emily Benson here asking what is the best forum to create this standard methodology, and if it's not in the WTO, then why not the OECD? We have Wolfgang Veit also on that question, asking if on the measurement of corporate carbon footprints does the Global Reporting Initiative and does the UN have a role in this? So I think everyone's sort of trying to understand, where should we be discussing the methodology issue?
Tricky question. There's a spaghetti bowl of methodologies as well, to use Constanza spaghetti CBAMs and so on. Of course, Global Reporting Initiative has a very important role to play. There's a lot of experience there, but ISO has own methodologies, and ISOs are private standards, and you can find for sure the EU to really implement CBAM for these specific sectors will need to bring their methodologies to the table. So OECD, of course, has a role to play. Everyone has a role to play. But the hard issue is, how do I measure? For example, let's take livestock, meat, beef. That is something very questionable in terms of GHG's emissions, because there's people that hate and people that love and so on. For me, the role on when we talk about beef production is how efficiently this beef is produced. Because if you have good pasture management, if you have technology, if you have good practice, if you have animal welfare, you will have low carbon beef. And this is important to reduce the amount of carbon per kilo of beef that is produced everywhere. But Does your methodology
Rodrigo,
accept?
just to push back on that, wouldn't you be ending up in a situation where each sector then requires its own sort of special committee in order to discuss specific life cycle analysis? So it can't be a cross-sectorial methodology. It's going to have to be product per product. I see Constanza and Stephanie want to join in. 1 minute, because we're on time and we still have more questions.
Very quickly, I want to contribute in this CBAM discussion. And I think discussing, as Stephanie said, the legality aspects, the legal aspects of that, it's important, but I don't think it's a clever strategy from the public and private sector just to focus on that and to put all the eggs in that bowl, because I think that there's a real legitimate concern in terms of carbon leakage. Probably it's not today's Brazil concern, because Brazil doesn't have yet a market. So we have previous concern, but that might come into as a second concern. And there's a clear leakage, carbon leakage and investment leakage concern that comes with this ambition into the global climate neutrality. And we need to give answers. So my contribution, apart from the ones that have been mentioned, would be to try also in parallel to focus on guidelines and principles for the design of those CBAMs. So there's been recent work on that aspect, and I think this would start. The tricky question is where. It's OECD might be an ideal place, but not all developing countries might be participating. But it's somehow creativity to try to work in parallel on the legal aspects, but also on the design main elements to make sure that there's some sort of safe harbor, let's say, in the design of those CBAMs would be an important element in my view.
Stephanie?
Yes, thank you very much. Yeah, I wanted to say, on the question relating to the best forum to discuss methodology, I would say, why not start discussing this at the COP26? I mean, I think the best possible solution would be to discuss those issues, methodologies as well as guidelines to design border adjustment, or at least climate mitigation measures, because I think that the right forum, and you were talking about the WTO, right? But this could be also taken into account by the WTO, by the WTO case law, for example. I think it's too difficult for judges. Well, even though now everything is stuck and the appellate body is not operative, but still, I think it's too difficult to judge, to really assess the effect of a measure. I mean, from a holistic point of view, to assess carbon linkage without any, references. So the discussion, I mean, the WTO could probably try to push for having this discussion within the framework of the UN. I think I really favor the interinstitutional dialogue. So the WTO has its role to play, but I do not think that the WTO could really decide on, methodologies or this kind of thing. But they should really push for that, because once we have some sort of standard, sustainability standard, I think it would be, in the end, it will be incorporated into the WTO.
But surely, I think we would end up with the same issue, is that then obviously the origin of the judges would define the methodologies, which is part, I think, of Rodrigo's earlier point. Eleonora, I'm going to give you 1 minute as we're going to wrap up today's session.
Yes, well, for us as well, I mean, instead of having this fragmentation, which for us, we see the problem there as well, it would be much better, as it is a global problem, to have a global solution. So the WTO is a bit weak as an institution at the moment in terms of creating rules and negotiations, and you would need consensus. So I think they can definitely start discussing the matter, and there is an element there in other more limited sectors like fossil fuels subsidies, for example. There is an initiative, and I think there again we can see plurilaterals more than multilateral agreements, so that we can advance, and then those countries that want to sign up to an initiative that is ongoing can do so. But otherwise, at the OECD, like we have done for other global issues, could be a solution. And when we look at the competitiveness as European business, we are also looking at not only competitiveness on the EU market, but also when our products go to third country markets, because of course the CBAM will also have an impact there. We want it to be non-discriminatory, so everything has to be for domestic products and imports in the same way, so that it's WTO compatible. For us, that aspect is important. It's one of the aspects that we are looking at. So we also look at the competitiveness of EU products once they compete on third country markets.
So, I mean, we're getting so many questions on the discrimination point, and obviously Rodrigo, speaking of beef, has lifted up a whole a chat storm here in Brussels. But we're going to have to close our session for today to keep within our timing. So we could obviously debate this topic for hours. I think all of these themes could be further developed, but it was really an interesting overview to look at it through so many dimensions. So I'd like to really thank everyone that sent in their questions. So many of you are interested in this topic. And a big thank you and a muito obrigada to our speakers for joining the conversation today. And finally, a great thank you to the team at ECIPE for all the hard work in making this webinar possible. And with that, I look forward to seeing you for a new debate very soon.